Elena stood at the gates of the Hathaway estate, the mansion looming large and intimidating. She tugged nervously at her coat, adjusting her grip on her worn leather bag. The air around her seemed colder than it should be for a spring evening, though it could have just been the nerves. Stepping through the front doors felt like entering another world. High ceilings, marble floors, and chandeliers that sparkled like stars. A far cry from the modest apartment she called home. Mrs. Hathaway greeted her with a curt nod. The woman's sharp eyes seemed to take in everything at once, from Eleanor's neat but simple attire to the slight tremble in her hands. "The girls are upstairs," Mrs. Hathaway said without preamble. "Their room is at the end of the hall. Make sure they're asleep by 8. They tend to get excitable." She barely looked at Elena as she spoke, her gaze fixed on something invisible beyond the windows. Elena nodded, though she felt the unspoken judgment. Mrs. Hathaway's cool demeanor did little to ease the tension in her chest. But that didn't matter now. What mattered were Sophia and Sylvia, the 6-year-old twins she had been hired to care for. The sound of giggles echoed down the hallway as Eleanor approached the children's room. The twins were seated on their plush, oversized beds, surrounded by an army of stuffed animals and enough toys to fill a small store. Sylvia, the more outgoing of the two, waved excitedly when Elena entered. "Elena!" she cried, jumping off the bed and running toward her. Sophia, quieter but just as lively, followed with a shy smile. "Hi, girls," Elena said softly, bending down to their level. "It's almost bedtime, but we've got time for one more story." They both scrambled back to their beds, eagerly awaiting whatever tale she would choose. Over the past few weeks, Eleanor had come to know their favorites, the ones with princesses, dragons, and brave knights. But tonight, she sensed they wanted something different. "Tell us about the Philippines again," Sophia asked, her voice small but curious. Eleanor hesitated for a moment. She rarely spoke of her home country, not because she didn't miss it, but because it felt so distant from this opulent life she now navigated. Still, the girls seemed genuinely interested. "Well," Eleanor began, sitting on the edge of Sophia's bed, "in the Philippines the sky can look like a painting at sunset. There are beaches with the softest sand and mountains that touch the clouds. And the people," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "they're warm, kind, always smiling, even if they don't have much." Sophia and Sylvia listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder. They had never known anything but the luxury surrounding them, and Elena wondered if they could truly grasp a world so different from their own. After finishing the story and tucking them in, Elena quietly closed their bedroom door. The hallway outside seemed unusually quiet, almost stifling. She stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping over her. The mansion, grand as it was, had an emptiness to it that gnawed at her. It wasn't just the physical space, the expansive rooms and long corridors. It was something deeper, a sensation she couldn't quite name. As she descended the staircase, the silence became more pronounced. Elena had been working here for a few weeks now, and while she had grown to love Sophia and Sylvia, there was something about this house that didn't sit right with her. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Hathaway never quite looked her in the eye, the way she mentioned Elena's hometown in unpleasant terms, or how Mr. Hathaway was always away on business trips, his presence more a shadow than a reality. Tonight, the feeling was stronger than ever. A vague, unsettling energy seemed to hang in the air. Eleanor shook her head, telling herself she was being silly. It was just an old house, and old houses had their quirks. Still, her steps quickened as she moved toward the kitchen to tidy up. She glanced at the large windows overlooking the garden. The night was still, but for some reason the darkness outside seemed heavier, thicker. Eleanor had always trusted her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. though she couldn't understand why. The sudden creak of a floorboard behind her made her jump. She whipped around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just the same empty hallway stretching out endlessly into the dark, shaking off the cold that had settled in her bones. Eleanor took a deep breath and turned back to her task. The house was safe. She was safe. But as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching. Elena pulled the thin blanket up to her chest, trying to settle in for the night. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast faint shadows across the room, but her mind was elsewhere, fixated on the constant ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. The house was quiet. Too quiet, she thought. Her two young daughters, Emily and Sophia, were already asleep in the room next door. She wanted to let her thoughts drift off, but something held her back. Then a faint noise caught her attention. At first, she dismissed it. The wind, maybe. The house was old, and the draughty hallways often creaked at night. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself. "It's nothing," she whispered in her mind. But the noise came again, a soft scraping sound, almost like something dragging across the floor. Her heartbeat quickened, and she instinctively glanced at the door. Eleanor sat up, her muscles tense. She strained her ears, waiting, hoping it wouldn't return. But the sound persisted, closer now, more distinct. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her thoughts raced, imagining everything from a stray animal trapped inside to far more unsettling possibilities. But she was the adult here, the one who needed to stay composed for the girls. "Calm down," she told herself. "Don't overthink this." But the rising anxiety was hard to shake. Her hand hovered over the phone on her nightstand, tempted to call someone. Anyone. She stood up, moving quietly across the wooden floor, not wanting to wake the girls. The hall outside was shrouded in near darkness, the weak light from her room barely spilling beyond the doorway. As she stepped out, the soft creaking beneath her feet made her cringe. She paused, listening again. There it was, a dull thud at the far end of the hallway near the guest room. Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted toward the source of the sound. The door at the end of the hallway, the one to the Hathaways' room, was slightly ajar. Elena's breath caught. Maybe they're awake, she thought, trying to stay rational. The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hathaway, had always been quiet, easy-going house guests. They wouldn't cause a disturbance at this hour, would they? But her gut told her otherwise. Forcing her legs to move, Eleanor padded slowly down the hall, the air growing heavier with each step. The silence around her was oppressive, pressing against her skin like a suffocating blanket. Every footstep seemed louder, the air thicker. She hesitated just before reaching the door, her hand shaking as she grasped the handle. Eleanor couldn't linger. She had to know what was behind that door. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The scene before her made her freeze. In the corner of the room, Mr. and Mrs. Hathaway were bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. They squirmed against the ropes but couldn't move much. Elena's stomach lurched as her mind processed the sight. The Hathaways, helpless, pleading silently for help, confirmed her worst fear. They were not alone in the house. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Whoever had done this was still inside, and now she was the one who had to protect the children. Her heart raced, each beat louder than the last, as she strained to hear it again. And then, from the dim hallway, a figure emerged, tall, masked, and menacing. His eyes glinted under the harsh moonlight seeping through the window, filled with something cruel and dangerous. Elena's throat tightened, her breath caught somewhere between a scream and a silent gasp. For a split second, she stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed. but the soft murmur of Sophia and Sylvia sleeping in the next room cut through her fear. The children. Her survival instincts kicked in, pushing her feet to move. She stepped backward, silently slipping into the shadows of the hallway. The intruder hadn't noticed her yet. Elena's mind raced, calculating the quickest way back to the girls. She needed to get them out of the house. Now. Elena eased the door open, just enough to slip inside. The room was dark, filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of Sophia and Sylvia. Her hands trembled as she gently shook them awake. "Shh, babies," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're going to play a game, okay? But you have to be very quiet for Mommy." Sophia, still half asleep, blinked up at her with wide eyes, while Sylvia squirmed in confusion. "A game?" Sophia asked, her voice heavy with drowsiness. "Yes, like we always play," Eleanor whispered, forcing a smile, though her insides were in knots. "You two will hide, and I'll come find you soon. But you have to stay very quiet and very still, all right?" The girls, still young enough to find delight in any game, nodded eagerly. Their sleepy confusion gave way to excitement as they climbed out of bed. Elena could feel the tension pressing down on her, every second feeling longer than the last. She led them to the back door, out into the garden, where the moonlight bathed the yard in an eerie glow. The treehouse. It was the only place she could think of that was far enough to hide them, but close enough that she could reach them quickly. "Climb up there," she whispered, pointing to the old wooden ladder leading to the treehouse. "Stay hidden, and don't come out until I call for you," Sylvia began, her small voice trembling with uncertainty. "Not now, sweetie. Just hide and remember the game. Quiet, like little mice." The two girls scrambled up the ladder, their small hands gripping the wood as they climbed into the treehouse. Eleanor waited until they were safely inside, watching them through the shadows. Her heart twisted at the sight. Too small, too innocent to understand the danger looming in their home. She turned back toward the house. Eleanor knew she needed to distract him, lead him away from the girls. The idea of going back inside felt like walking into a trap, but she had no choice. If she didn't, the man might find them, and the thought of that happening was more terrifying than any fear she had ever known. Her feet felt heavy as she walked back through the back door into the dim kitchen. With a trembling hand, she reached for a metal pan hanging on the wall. The cold steel was reassuring, but her legs wobbled as she dropped it onto the floor with a loud clang. The noise shattered the silence of the house. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, and Eleanor held her breath, listening. She could hear footsteps now, moving through the hallway, heavy and deliberate. He was coming. She needed to keep him here, away from the back door, away from her daughters. Her chest tightened as she heard the intruder's footsteps grow closer, his shadow stretching across the hallway floor. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, but she clenched her fists, bracing herself. Sophia and Sylvia hadn't yet grasped the severity of the situation. The house, usually filled with warm light and the distant hum of daily activity, now felt unnervingly still. But for the two girls, the silence was more confusing than frightening. Sophia, the older of the two, nudged Sylvia gently. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The little girl nodded, her wide eyes reflecting the dim glow of the hallway as they crept quietly out of their room. They approached cautiously, the heavy oak door just within reach. Sophia reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the cold brass knob. Suddenly, they both froze. A noise, distant but unmistakable, a soft shuffling, followed by the sound of something metallic clattering to the floor, came from behind them from somewhere deeper in the house. Sophia's grip on Sylvia tightened, and she slowly pulled the door open, enough for them to slip through without a sound. The cold night air hit their faces as they stepped into the backyard. She looked around quickly, scanning the familiar surroundings. The tall grass of the garden, the stone path leading to the shed. Nothing stirred. Sylvia tugged at her sleeve. "What do we do now?" she asked in a hushed voice, her small frame trembling slightly in the chill. "We hide," Sophia replied, her voice steady but firm. She pointed to the large tree at the far end of the yard, its branches thick and leafy, obscuring the small wooden treehouse they had built with Elena years ago. "In the treehouse. They won't find us there." Without another word, they hurried across the lawn, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. The tree loomed above them, and Sophia helped Sylvia up the first few steps of the wooden ladder before climbing up herself. Inside the treehouse, the two girls settled down, their backs pressed against the rough wooden walls. The space was small and dark, but it felt safe, like a sanctuary from the unknown. "Will Elena come for us?" Sylvia asked, her voice small and uncertain. Sophia hesitated. She reassured her sister to tell her that Elena would be back soon, that everything would be fine. "We have to stay quiet," Sophia said instead, her voice barely more than a breath. "Just like Elena told us. We wait." Sylvia nodded and curled up next to her sister, seeking comfort in the closeness. Sophia wrapped an arm around her, staring out into the night through a small gap in the treehouse wall. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting faint shadows on the ground below. For a while, they sat in silence, their breathing shallow as they listened for any sign of movement from the house. The treehouse, usually a place of joy and adventure, now felt like a fortress, keeping the outside world at bay. Sophia closed her eyes, trying to calm the rising panic in her chest. They had done what Elena had told them to. Now it was just a matter of time. Time and silence. Elena leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to steady her breath. The masked intruder was still upstairs, oblivious to her presence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had to act quickly. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed through the house as he tore through closets and cabinets, searching for the two girls she had hidden. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe she had time. Silently, Eleanor crept towards the hallway, the cool tile under her feet grounding her. Her eyes darted toward the door to Mr. Hathaway's office. It was just down the hall. If she could make it there, she could use the landline to call the police. But one wrong move, and she knew she'd be caught. She slipped into the hallway, careful not to make a sound, her breath shallow. She glanced behind her, but the house felt like it was holding its breath with her, the only sound being the distant clatter of the intruder upstairs. She reached the door to Mr. Hathaway's office, her trembling hand on the doorknob. A loud crash came from above. She flinched, freezing in place. The sound of shattered glass was followed by the unmistakable thud of furniture being upturned. He was growing frustrated. She could hear it in his movements. He hadn't found the girls yet. That was good, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Elena slowly turned the knob, her movements precise. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The office smelled of leather and aged books, the room dimly lit by the small desk lamp. She quickly scanned the space for the phone, spotting it near a stack of paperwork. As she reached for the receiver, a creak from the hallway stopped her cold. The intruder was coming. She dropped the phone without making a sound and ducked behind Mr. Hathaway's large oak desk, her body tensing as the footsteps grew louder. She could see his shadow cast through the thin slit under the door. The footsteps paused. Eleanor held her breath. The door creaked open. Her heart raced as the intruder's boots slowly crossed the threshold, his heavy breathing filling the space. He paused at the desk, and for a moment, Elena thought she had avoided detection, but then the desk shifted. He had found her. Before she could react, his gloved hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her to her feet. She gasped in pain as he twisted her arm behind her back. His mask, expressionless and cold, loomed inches from her face as he bound her hands and stuffed a rag into her mouth. Her muffled protests were useless. He dragged her through the house, her legs stumbling behind him, the world spinning as her desperation mounted. In the living room, Mr. and Mrs. Hathaway sat huddled together, fear etched across their faces. The intruder pushed Elena to the floor in front of them, his voice low and menacing. "Your nanny has been cooperative," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "She's already handed over the girls to me. Now, unless you want to see them hurt, I suggest you tell me the code to your safe." Mrs. Hathaway's eyes went wide with terror. She glanced at Elena, her face crumbling. "What have you done? How could you?" Her voice was shrill, hysterical. She lunged at Elena, tears streaming down her face, her fists pounding against her in a panic. "You monster! You handed them over! How could you betray us like this?" Elena squirmed, trying to signal with her eyes, desperately shaking her head, but the gag muffled her words. She hadn't given him anything. She had protected the girls. But Mrs. Hathaway's fear clouded her judgment, and she couldn't see beyond her panic. Mr. Hathaway, though pale and trembling, raised a hand to stop his wife's assault. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but strained. He looked directly at the intruder. "I'll give you the code. Just don't hurt the girls." The intruder's head tilted, the hollow eyes of his mask fixed on Mr. Hathaway. "Good choice," he said, his grip tightening on Elena's shoulder, as if to remind them both who was in control. Elena's eyes widened as she watched Mr. Hathaway open his mouth to speak. Time slowed. If the code was given, it could all be over. But if she didn't find a way to communicate, something far worse awaited them all. The masked man grinned beneath his cover as he typed in the final characters of the password. His footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway, each one lighter than the last, as though the weight of his triumph had lifted any doubt. Elena watched him leave, her pulse racing. She glanced at Mr. Hathaway beside her. With her eyes, she gestured urgently toward her mouth. Hathaway, though exhausted and panicked, understood. His fingers fumbled at first, but managed to peel the duct tape away from her lips. Elena gasped for breath and immediately whispered, "The children are safe. For now. He doesn't know they've been hidden." Mr. Hathaway's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. His wife, bound nearby, watched as he quickly worked to free her as well. In the tense silence of the room, the three of them fidgeted, trying to untangle the tight knots that had held them hostage for hours. Elena's heart pounded, her thoughts racing. Every second counted. They moved quietly, almost mechanically, their hands shaking. The dark room, lit only by the dim glow from outside, felt suffocating, and every creak of the house sent shivers down their spines. Eleanor's mind was focused on one thing: escape. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway, footsteps. Rapid and heavy, they grew louder, closer. Eleanor froze, her fingers slipping on the rope she was desperately trying to untie. Mr. and Mrs. Hathaway stopped moving as if their hearts had ceased beating altogether. The masked man re-entered the room, his dark figure towering over them. His eyes, visible through the narrow slits of his mask, darted between them, sensing something had shifted. For a long moment, silence reigned. He seemed to weigh his options, deciding whether to punish them or continue with his plan. But then, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. Hope, fragile yet defiant, flickered in Elena's chest. The man stood still for a beat, his body rigid. The noise grew louder, drawing closer, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. His reaction was immediate. He bolted for the back door. Eleanor exhaled shakily, not daring to believe that the worst might be over. "He's running," she whispered. Mr. Hathaway, having freed himself, helped his wife as quickly as his trembling hands allowed. They couldn't waste a second. Outside in the sprawling backyard, chaos erupted. The masked man was fast, his lithe body cutting through the shadows of the trees, but the police were relentless. They poured into the yard, flashlights cutting through the night. He vaulted over a fence, landing in a neighbor's garden, but 2 officers were right behind him. The chase was a blur of motion, him darting through bushes, slipping over wet grass, the officers closing in with every step. He skidded down a narrow alley, barely catching his balance, when a heavy body slammed into him from the side. One of the officers had leaped, tackling him to the ground. The masked man struggled, but the officer's grip was firm. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists before he had the chance to make another move. Back inside, the sound of footsteps flooded the house as more officers entered. Elena sagged in relief, her knees weak. Mr. Hathaway pulled her to her feet just as the police burst into the room. "You're safe now," one of the officers said, his voice a calming contrast to the chaos that had filled the night. Mrs. Hathaway sobbed into her husband's chest, and for a moment all 3 stood together, their bonds finally gone, but the emotional weight still heavy. Elena reached for her phone and saw the missed calls and texts from the police. It hit her then. It was her earlier message, sent before the man had returned, that had alerted them. "They're safe?" Elena asked, her voice fragile. The officer nodded. "Your daughters are with us now?" "Unharmed." The relief was overwhelming. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for that later. Now all that mattered was that it was over. The air in the Hathaway estate was thick with unease. In the dimly lit study, Mr. Hathaway sat at his desk, hands shaking slightly as he sifted through the documents that had recently been uncovered. The truth was staring him in the face, but it was too bitter to swallow. Mrs. Hathaway, usually composed, stood at the window, staring out into the garden with vacant eyes. The silence between them was as palpable as the tension in the room. The masked man was Chris, a former employee, once trusted, now nothing more than a traitor. "It doesn't make sense." Mr. Hathaway finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "Chris, he worked for us for years. Why would he—" Police cleared her throat, her voice steady but low. "People change, sir. Or maybe we never truly know them." Mrs. Hathaway turned from the window, her face pale. "But to think that he, after everything, he betrayed us like this." Her voice wavered, and for a moment she looked far older than she was. "I trusted him. We trusted him." Police took a step forward. "He harbored resentment after his dismissal. I found evidence that he had been planning this for some time. He wanted revenge, but more than that, he wanted your assets. It wasn't just about spite. It was greed." The room fell silent again, the weight of Chris's betrayal settling in. To the Hathaways, he hadn't just been a disgruntled employee. He had been part of the family in a way. And yet he had come back with a mask of loyalty, only to rip apart the foundation of trust they had once had. "I never thought someone we knew so well?" Mr. Hathaway shook his head slowly. At that moment, Ilana walked in to announce that the children were receiving medical attention. Mr. Hathaway turned to Elena and said, "Thank you, Elena. If it wasn't for you—" Elena nodded, remaining composed, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "I was just doing my job." But the Hathaways didn't see it that way. To them, she had done far more than a job. She had saved them from a tragedy that could have been much worse. Mrs. Hathaway moved closer to Elena, her eyes softening. "I misjudged you, Eleanor. I spoke harshly before, and for that I am deeply sorry." Eleanor hesitated, not used to such heartfelt apologies. She gave a small, respectful bow of her head. "You don't have to apologize. I understand your concerns for your family." "No," Mrs. Hathaway insisted, her voice firmer now. "I was wrong. You protected our daughter. You exposed a man who could have done unimaginable harm. For that, I will always be grateful." Elena didn't respond immediately, but the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. Mr. Hathaway rose from his desk, crossing the room with a newfound resolve. "We owe you more than thanks, Elena. You've proven yourself in ways we can't ignore. From now on, you are not just an employee. You're family." Elena stood there, almost unsure of how to respond. She had never sought recognition or a place in their family. Her job had always been clear: protect and serve. Yet, here she was, being welcomed into a circle she had never imagined herself a part of. Mrs. Hathaway stepped forward and took Elena's hand gently. "We want you to stay with us, not just as an employee, but as part of our family. Your bravery, your loyalty, we're honored to have you with us." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. For so long, she had kept her emotions in check, her focus solely on her duty. But in this moment, something inside her softened. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Hathaway said kindly. "You've already done enough." The chapter of betrayal had ended, but a new one was beginning. The Hathaways, once shattered by the revelation of Chris's treachery, were now united in a bond forged by trust and gratitude. And Eleanor, once a protector from the outside, had found herself in the heart of their family, where loyalty truly mattered. The hum of the new security system buzzed quietly in the background as the Hathaway household seemed to settle into a different rhythm. Since the incident, the atmosphere in the house had changed, not tense but more aware, more cautious. The reinforced locks, the sleek alarm system with its blinking red light, all were constant reminders of the night that no one dared to speak about out loud. Eleanor stood in the kitchen watching Sophia and Sylvia play with a puzzle at the dining room table. Their laughter filled the air, but she couldn't help noticing the occasional hesitance in their movements, the quick glances at the doors and windows. The trauma lingered in subtle ways, and the girls, despite their resilience, were still healing. "Can I help with dinner?" Sophia asked suddenly, looking up at Elena with bright eyes, eager to shift the focus. Elena smiled, nodding. "Of course. How about you stir the sauce for me?" The little girl hopped off her chair and eagerly took her place beside Elena. Sylvia, not wanting to be left out, joined them, though quieter, still observing. Elena glanced down at her wrists, the faint scars still visible but fading, a constant reminder of how close things had come to falling apart. Yet every time she saw the girls' smiles, a deep sense of peace would wash over her. They were safe now. The Hathaway parents, Robert and Linda, were more protective than ever, leaving nothing to chance. The house was now a fortress with state-of-the-art alarms, and they had hired a security team to patrol the property at night. But the real work was not in the hardware or the patrols. It was in the therapy sessions, the long, difficult conversations that were slowly helping the family navigate the wreckage of their emotions. Robert entered the room, his face weary but softened by the sight of his daughters. "How are the little chefs doing?" "Learning fast," Eleanor replied, her tone light but her eyes holding more. "Good." He leaned against the counter, watching the girls for a moment, before his voice lowered. "And you? How are you feeling?" Elena hesitated, unsure how to answer. The nights were still long, and the memories still crept in uninvited. But there was a calm now, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt before. She looked at him and smiled faintly. Better, I think. It's just taking time. Robert nodded, understanding in his eyes. He didn't press. The truth was she had become more than just their nanny. She was part of the family now, woven into their lives in a way that felt unspoken but permanent. They all knew it. Later that evening, the family gathered in the living room, a fire crackling softly in the fireplace. The girls cuddled up on the couch, Sophia already falling asleep against Elena's shoulder. Linda, sitting nearby, sipped her tea, her eyes drifting between her daughters and Elena with a quiet gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire. "You've been our anchor through all of this." Eleanor looked at her, surprised by the rawness of the words. She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the right words. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling the warmth of the room settle over her. The therapy sessions continued, each one peeling back layers of fear and pain, especially for the girls. Sophia had started drawing again, her pictures slowly moving away from dark shadows and empty rooms to brighter skies and smiling faces. Sylvia, who had been quieter since the night of the incident, was beginning to talk more, opening up in small, hesitant bursts. And Eleanor, despite the nightmares that still occasionally shook her awake, found peace in the simple moments. The smell of dinner cooking, the sound of laughter in the house, the knowledge that the Hathaway family was healing together. The scars would fade, the fear would lessen, and though none of them would ever forget, there was a future here, one filled with hope and maybe even happiness. The warm rays of the afternoon sun cascaded down over the Hathaway family estate, illuminating the lush green garden where Sophia and Sylvia played. Their laughter echoed through the air, carefree and light, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that had gripped their home just 6 months ago. The garden was now a sanctuary, brimming with life, flowers blooming, birds chirping, a far cry from the shadow it had once cast over their lives. Sophia and Sylvia chased each other around the tall oak tree, their giggles infectious. There were no longer any dark thoughts lurking in the back of their minds, no nightmares to disrupt their sleep. For the first time in what felt like years, they were simply children, enjoying the pure freedom of play. Elena watched them from the kitchen window, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But things had changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, she had become more than just the person who cleaned and cooked. She had become a part of them, a crucial thread woven into the fabric of their family. She had witnessed the family's healing, been part of it, and had felt the shift in her own life as well. She wasn't just an observer. She belonged here now, among them. And so, the story of the Hathaway family comes to an end, but the lessons of connection, gratitude, and the power of love remain. They overcame seemingly impossible challenges and rebuilt a life full of hope and peace together. Sometimes it's those we think are on the sidelines who become the strongest support in our lives. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, where love, unity, and hope will always shine through. See you in the next video.